The next Torah portion is Toldot, which variously could be translated as generations of, chronicles of, history of, children of, descendants of. As you remember, the Torah portion from last time was Chaye Sarah, which was an account of the death of Sarah and all of the involved machinations involved in finding her a burial place, then the search for a wife for Isaac among Abraham's kindred in Mesopotamia. That Torah portion ends with a recounting of Ishmael and his descendants, and then ends with the death of Ishmael. So this Torah portion begins describing the descendants of Abraham, and they only really mention Isaac because he is the one with whom the covenant will be continuing. There's really no animosity to speak of between Ishmael and Isaac. It's just that for whatever reason God wanted Isaac, the son of Sarah and Abraham, to carry on the covenant. Ishmael is said to be the progenitor of the Arabs, so his descendants have certainly done well. In any event, the focus now turns to Isaac and his life. He is 40 years old when he marries Rebekah. 20 years elapses, though, between their marriage and Rebekah having children. She's barren, as are all three of the major matriarchs, Sarah, Rebekah, and later on Rachel, who's Jacob's wife, or his favorite wife. Isaac entreats God to allow Rebekah to conceive, and she does ultimately, and carries twins. When she inquires of God why the twins are so contentious within the womb, she is told that the two brothers will be in conflict with each other perpetually. The first to emerge is Esau, also pronounced Esau, E-S-A-U. So he comes out first, and he's all hairy, which is one of the reasons he's given the name Esau. His homeland is called Seir too, which means hairy. The second to emerge is Jacob, and he's grabbing onto Esau's heel. As you may have caught on by now, people's names point to certain features of either who they are or events in their lives. So the Hebrew word for heel is Akev, which is the root of Jacob's name. The root also means on account of, and it can also mean to supplant or to deceive or to defraud. And as you'll see in the course of Jacob's life, he is guilty of or gets involved with situations where either he is defrauded or he does the defrauding. So the two boys grow up, and Esau becomes a hunter. He's skilled with implements of hunting. He spends a lot of time out in the field. And Jacob stays home. He's basically a homebody, stays in tents. And at that point, they state that Isaac loved Esau and Rebekah loved Jacob. Similar to the case of Ishmael, there's enmity between the Arabs and the Hebrews, but that really isn't part and parcel of the relationship of Isaac and Ishmael. They seem to more or less get along pretty well, other than the episode where Sarah gets angry at Ishmael and expels him. But between Isaac and Ishmael, they seem to do fine together. And it's comparable also to the situation with Jacob and Esau. There's a whole mythology of Esau being the progenitor of Rome and the Roman Empire, which over the centuries has not been kind to the Jews. But Esau himself does not seem to be a bad person. He's a little bit on the simple-minded side, kind of a man of the earth, but he never really comes across as evil. Maybe a bit slow-witted, but essentially not a bad person. To the contrary, one would get the sense from reading these narratives that the more mischievous, the more deceitful of the twins was Jacob. So a case in point is one afternoon Esau comes in from the field and he's just totally exhausted. And he meets up with Jacob, who's cooking a stew. And he asks Jacob for some food because he's going to die. which may or may not have been the case. And so Jacob takes advantage of that situation and asks for the birthright in exchange for feeding Esau. And Esau kind of throws up his hands and says, I'm going to die anyway, what's the point of having a birthright? So Jacob makes him swear, Esau swears, and they exchange the birthright for a bowl of stew. Oh, interestingly, the stew is red, which in Hebrew is a dome or a dome. And that's one of the reasons that Esau is later called Edom. Maybe he's the progenitor of the Edomites, but the whole connection between the Edomites and Esau in Rome is a little more speculative. Comparable to the narratives with Sarah and Abraham, there's also a famine in Canaan, and Isaac and Rebekah begin to travel to Egypt, but God appears to Isaac when he is in the land of the Philistines and tells him to not descend to Egypt. Instead, God takes this opportunity to bless Isaac. He promises Isaac the land that he's currently residing in, as well as all of these lands, which is a little unclear. It bespeaks more than simply inheriting the land of the Philistines. He's also promised a vast number of offspring and is also told that he will be carrying on Abraham's blessing. Likewise, he claims that Rebekah, his wife, is his sister. And it's the same kind of reason that Abraham gave for calling his wife Sarah his sister as well, because of being afraid that the locals will kill him in order to abscond with his wife. So Isaac and Rebekah are living happily in the land of the Philistines, but the king of the Philistines spies them one day sporting with each other, the same root Sachak, which is the basis of Isaac's name. And the king likewise calls out Isaac and asks him why he foisted that untruth upon him, because he was about to take off with Rebekah. Instead of expelling him from the land, though, the king of the Philistines allows them to stay, as a result of which Isaac becomes quite rich, quite wealthy, with slaves and maidservants and crops and camels and sheep and goats and all that. The locals become jealous, and they stop up the wells that Abraham had dug when he was living in Philistia. The king of the Philistines expels Isaac, but he stays in the general vicinity. He starts to redig the wells that the Philistines had stopped up, and there's a lot of strife over the wells. Finally, Isaac and his servants dig a well which there is no contention over, and they're able to settle down. At that point, God appears again to Isaac to comfort him. At a certain point, with the success of Isaac, even after having been expelled, Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, and his entourage seek out Isaac and want to make a covenant with him. And Isaac is quite straightforward. He's asking the king and the entourage, why are you here? You hate me. You expelled me from town. And they respond saying, well, you're obviously blessed by God, so we'd like to partake of the bounty as well. The scene then changes, and Esau is described as marrying two Canaanite women who are what's called a provocation of the spirit or a bitterness of the spirit of his parents, Isaac and Rebekah. But they were local girls, and Esau wanted to get married. So after a certain period of time, Isaac is getting old. He's losing his sight, and he wants to bless Esau, to give him the blessing of the firstborn. Now it's a little unclear why Isaac would be giving the blessing of the firstborn to Esau if Esau had sold the birthright previously to Jacob, but the text is silent on that matter. So Isaac asks Esau to go hunting, find some wild meat, to prepare delicacies that Isaac loves in order to boost his spirit and get him in a state ready to bless. It's an interesting description, or it's an interesting bit of information. If it's really a God-given blessing, you would think it would be akin to being in a prophetic state, to be able to channel the blessing of God through you to somebody else. And there are a number of instances where the text gives hints about what promotes prophecy or what induces or makes prophecy more likely. Sometimes it's sleep deprivation, sometimes it's wandering in the desert, sometimes it is celibacy, other times it's music, and in this case it seems to be delicious food. Rebekah overhears this discussion between Isaac and Esau, and that Esau is about to receive the blessing instead of Jacob, her beloved. So she tells Jacob what's going on and begins a rather complicated ruse. She tells Jacob to go to the herd and slaughter some choice goats, and she will cook the delicacies, and Jacob will go in to Isaac and steal the blessing, which was intended for Esau. So Jacob complains, he protests. Not as much that it's the wrong thing to do, but that his ruse will be discovered. He states that his skin is smooth, it isn't hairy, and Rebekah puts the goat skin from the slaughtered goats that she's made the delicacies from, both on his arms and on his neck. And Jacob is afraid that if the ruse is discovered, that Isaac will curse him instead of bless him. And Rebekah says, the curses will be on me. Just do what I say. So Jacob comes into Isaac's tent, and there's very peculiar exchange that goes on between them. You could say, just reading the text, that Jacob is lying through his teeth in response to Isaac's questions. Are you my firstborn? Are you Esau? Are you my son? How did you make the food so quickly? All those things. And Jacob is quite evasive. He does not give really straight answers, but the answers satisfy Isaac enough. And after Isaac eats, he's in a good mood, and he gives the blessing of the firstborn to Jacob. So Jacob steps out, and Esau comes in one step later, and Isaac is just blown away, like, who are you? And Esau says, I'm Esau, your firstborn. And Isaac says, well, who is that I just blessed? And Esau emits a great and bitter cry. He complains about Jacob, saying his name isn't Jacob for nothing. He's deceived me. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the translations of the root from which the name Jacob comes can be just deceive or defraud or supplant. In any event, Isaac still has got some power to bless, and he gives Esau a blessing, but is pretty second rate. The one point that he makes, though, is that if Isaac aggrieves Esau, then Esau is free of the yoke of Isaac. So it's comparable to the description that Rebekah gets early on when she discovers that she has twins, that there's going to be an eternal back and forth seesaw between the two peoples, the descendants of Esau and the descendants of Jacob. Not surprisingly, Esau hates Jacob and wants to kill him after Isaac's impending death. Rebekah learns of Esau's plans and comes up with another ruse to send Jacob away while Esau's temper cools. The ruse is for Rebekah to say that she doesn't want Jacob to marry a Canaanite woman. And so instead of what happened in the case of Isaac, where Abraham sends the servant to Padan Aram to find a wife to bring back to Isaac, in this case Rebekah says, or strategizes, to send Jacob himself up to Padan Aram to Rebekah's brother Laban and to find a wife there and then to bring her back. So Jacob leaves on his way to Padan Aram to see Laban's family, Rebekah's brother. And in the meantime, Esau realizes that the Canaanite wives are really bothering his parents. So instead of divorcing the Canaanite wives, he just takes another wife, this one from Ishmael, who is Abraham's son and therefore not a Canaanite. So that's pretty much the end of this Torah portion. The following one is Vayetze, which means and he went forth, which is the beginning of the trip to Laban in Padan Aram by Jacob to find a wife. One thing that you might be picking up from these accounts is that the progenitors, the patriarchs and the matriarchs, are not super people. They're not mythological heroes. They've got faults. They lie, they steal, they deceive. So it isn't as if the plan for the Hebrew people or the Jews is hatched from some version of paradise. It's a very long, gritty, roundabout sort of journey with a lot of fits and starts, lots of steps backward as well as steps forward. It isn't a myth in that way where everything turns out great in the end. This is a lot more down to earth and real life, with real life people with their strengths and their weaknesses. So these are not supermen and superwomen. They're chosen, but it's not exactly clear why God has such a stake in this very small group of people, at least at this point. Okay, so I hope you like this video, and if so, please like it and subscribe to the channel. And until next time, thank you.